Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 26 September 2024. It is the 133rd anniversary of the birth of Hans Reichenbach, who was born in Hamburg on this date in 1891. Reichenbach is remembered as a mathematician and a philosopher of science, and I don't know of anyone who has talked about Reichenbach in connection with philosophy of history, so why would I bring him up? Reichenbach wrote two books on time, The Philosophy of Space and Time and The Direction of Time, with The Direction of Time being the last book that he published in his life. I've argued in several episodes that a philosophy of history ought to be based on a philosophy of time. So Reichenbach gives us a philosophy of time consistent with, or better, based on the science of Reichenbach's time. Reichenbach also wrote a work of history from Copernicus to Einstein. This is a history of the development of science from the beginnings of the scientific revolution up to the early 20th century. Reichenbach's scientific perspective points us to both the immediacy of time and to the longest periods of cosmological history. Human history, always the traditional focus of history, occupies a middle ground between the immediacy of time, which is intimately known to us through the experience of consciousness, and the eons of cosmology that science has revealed to us. But it is in the middle distance of human history that scientific discovery takes place. That is to say, the human scale of time that interests traditional historians is the scale of time at which a part of the universe that has evolved the ability to understand itself acquires the knowledge of the conditions of its existence and its place within the universe that produced it. So there are two histories: the history of the universe, of which the knowing being is a part, and which includes the stages in the development of that knowing being, and the history of scientific discoveries that have disclosed to that knowing being how it came to be, from the earliest origins of the universe to that being's awareness of the earliest origins of the universe. In the first history, for example, electromagnetic radiation has been propagating at the speed of light since the origins of the universe. In the second history, the scientific determination of the speed of light occurred in 1676 and was preceded by ideas about light that did not reflect a scientific understanding of the world. And the place of light within the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation was not fully appreciated until Maxwell formulated his equations that theoretically unified light and electromagnetism. So while Reichenbach sets out in his history book to tell the reader about the most recent cosmological theory, which, well, for his time was relativity, he discusses the lives of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton at their human scale of time. We can take it as a further principle of Copernicanism that a knowing being, while partaking of the history of the cosmos entire, comes to an understanding of this relationship at the same time scale of its own knowing, which is in turn embedded in a social context. And the time of that social context, of course, is history. Human history is like the tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum revealed to us by our eyes. And in From Copernicus to Einstein, Reichenbach wrote of that, quote, "It appears to us as if the world were covered with a curtain with a small hole through which we are allowed to contemplate only a fringe of nature's immense riches," unquote. So just so, the whole of cosmological history is covered by a curtain, you might say, and human history is a small hole through which we are allowed to contemplate only a fringe of nature's immense riches. And it is this small hole of human history through which we contemplate the cosmos that is the subject matter of Reichenbach's From Copernicus to Einstein. In my episode on Haskell Fane, I quoted Fane on the need for speculative philosophies of the history of science. And Fane wrote, quote, "What positivism lacked was a penetrating speculative philosophy of the history of science, the encouragement to fashion storylines upon which better histories of science could be constructed. Each kind of history requires its own kind of speculative philosophy of history, unquote. And there is a speculative philosophy of history of science implicit in Reichenbach's history. On the very first page of the book, we find a couple of interesting theoretical claims about history. Quote, astronomy as a science has come to forget its primitive wonder. Instead, it approaches the realm of stars with sober research and calculation. This disenchantment with its subject matter, with which scientific study invariably entails, has permeated astronomy to a greater degree than the layman realizes. In observing the astronomers of today, how they measure, take notes, calculate, how little attention they pay to mysterious speculations, one may be surprised to find the wonderful structure of learning so cut and dry at a close range. Yet nothing is more wrong and more objectionable than the feeling of a heartbreaking loss with which some people regard the vanishing mysticism of the skies. Although science may have destroyed a few naive fantasies, what she has put in their place is so immensely greater that we can well bear the loss, unquote. In this passage, Reichenbach has employed the idea of the disenchantment of the universe following on the scientific revolution, which had been originally formulated by Max Weber. And the paragraph finishes with the now familiar idea that whatever has been lost to disenchantment, the compensations offered by science more than make up for this. The mythology scholar Joseph Campbell later made this claim, writing that with science, quote, we have a still greater, more alive revelation than anything our old religions ever gave us, unquote. And the continuing pursuit of science promises a boundless future of exploration and discovery, together with the continual growth of the human mind. Reichenbach's twofold contribution to the philosophy of history, then, lies in his philosophy of time, including the application of this philosophy of time to history, and the implicit philosophy of history in his history of modern science. It's mostly Reichenbach's philosophy of time that interests me. In my episode on J.M.E. McTaggart, I discussed what I called the historical supervenience principle, according to which a philosophy of time is implicit in any philosophy of history, and vice versa. Having thought more about this, I can distinguish 4 permutations of the historical supervenience principle, with each of the 4 mutations formulated relative to naturalism, and I'll come back to that. These 4 are: 1, any conception of history supervenes on a conception of time. 2, any naturalistic conception of history supervenes on a conception of time. 3, any conception of history supervenes on a naturalistic conception of time. And 4, any naturalistic conception of history supervenes on a naturalistic conception of time. These 4 permutations are quite similar, but the differences among them, while they are subtle, are nevertheless important. So let's take each one separately. The first, any conception of history supervenes on a conception of time. This is the most general formulation of the idea, according to which any history involves some philosophy of time, and any philosophy of time involves some philosophy of history. Being the most general formulation, it is also the formulation with the least content to it. And in this form, the historical supervenience principle is little more than a nod to implicit presuppositions about time in any account of history. 2, any naturalistic conception of history supervenes on a conception of time. This formulation limits supervenience upon time to naturalistic philosophies of history, implying that non-naturalistic philosophies of history do not, in fact, supervene upon any conception of time, or do not need to supervene upon any conception of time, in turn implying a greater degree of autonomy on the part of non-naturalistic philosophies of history. By the same token, however, naturalistic conceptions of history have less autonomy because they are more tightly coupled to a conception of time, whatever that conception of time is. Number three, any conception of history supervenes on a naturalistic conception of time. This formulation implies that any conception of history, whether we know it or not, whether naturalistic or not, supervenes on a naturalistic conception of time, which means that a naturalistic conception of time is the foundation of all conception of history, regardless of their ontological or epistemological commitments. In this formulation of the historical supervenience principle, it is a naturalistic conception of time that is foundational and is expressed in all history. And four, any naturalistic conception of history supervenes on a naturalistic conception of time. This formulation is the narrowest, confining historical supervenience only to naturalistic conception of history supervening on a naturalistic conception of time. But while this is the narrowest of the four permutations I have considered, in another sense, it is a schema for an entire class of historical supervenience principles. Since I've formulated my four permutations of the principle of historical supervenience relative to naturalism, the possibility of formulating them relative to some other metaphysical scheme reveals another principle implicit in these four permutations that I've laid out. The schema that we can derive from the final and narrowest of historical supervenience principles is this: any such and such conception of history supervenes on a such and such conception of time. That is to say, each metaphysical scheme corresponds to a conception of time and an associated conception of history that supervenes on this metaphysically specific conception of time. Thus, not only does a naturalistic conception of time supervene on a naturalistic conception of time, it's also the case that a non-naturalistic conception of history supervenes on a non-naturalistic conception of time. And you could argue that this is what we find in St. Augustine, who I will mention a bit later. This is more specific. This schema for a historical supervenience principle is more specific. It has more content than the first permutation, which I said was the most general. But in another sense, it is the familiar idea that a philosophy of history can be derived from any distinctive metaphysical position. And I've discussed this and closely related ideas in several episodes so far. Reichenbach's conception of time is thoroughly naturalistic and intentionally so. He wanted to produce a naturalistic conception of time, and it only makes sense that we would derive a naturalistic philosophy of history from this naturalistic conception of time. Moreover, Reichenbach's naturalism is the early 20th century naturalism of logical empiricism, and he's keen to provide a rigorously scientific basis to his account of time. Despite the radicalism implicit in Reichenbach's logical empiricism, his history and his philosophy of time are, in a sense, traditionalist. Reichenbach's history, from Copernicus to Einstein, that I've quoted from a couple times already, is a story of larger-than-life figures: Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and Einstein. Reichenbach several times calls Einstein the Copernicus of our time, meaning when he was writing the book, making Copernicus a kind of historical exemplar of the scientists whose type only rarely appears in history and which was represented in Reichenbach's time by Einstein. And Reichenbach ends from Copernicus to Einstein on an amusing rhetorical flourish that invokes Schopenhauer. Quote, "Just as the Copernican worldview became at last generally recognized and a common property of all educated people, so will it be with the theory of relativity. 100 years from now, the doctrine will be accepted as self-evident, and it will be difficult to comprehend why it encountered at first so much opposition. In Schopenhauer's words, truth is allowed only a brief interval of victory between the two long periods when it is condemned as paradox or belittled as trivial. We who are permitted to see this period of victory with our own eyes may consider ourselves fortunate to witness the Copernican discovery of our age," unquote. So he is presenting himself as witness to an important historical event and considers himself, you could say, privileged to be witness to the achievement of Einstein. This is what Nietzsche called monumental history, which I've mentioned in several episodes. And we've seen in the episode on Thomas Kuhn that the tradition of monumental history has been on the back foot, with recent historiography of science focusing on the fine detail of scientific discovery rather than on the greater than life-size figures of heroes of scientific discovery. Reichenbach's conception of time is also, in a sense, traditionalist in his references to the flow of time. Many recent philosophers have criticized the description of time as flowing, as being a mere metaphor, and they also criticize the familiar metaphor of time as a river. In The Direction of Time, Reichenbach begins his exposition with what he calls a qualitative account of time, which will later be contrasted to his quantitative causal theory of time. But in the qualitative description of time, Reichenbach doesn't hesitate to say that time flows. Of course, many philosophers have explicitly acknowledged that our language falls short when it attempts to describe time. This is one of the sources of the most famous discussions of time in philosophy, the 11th book of St. Augustine's Confessions, which begins with the well-known assertion that when no one asks Augustine, he knows perfectly well what time is, but when someone asks him, he doesn't know. In other words, he can't frame his understanding of time in explicit propositions and communicate them to others. Many other philosophers since Augustine have struggled with the problem of giving a rational account of time. Reichenbach's older contemporary Husserl wrote hundreds of pages attempting to describe time as it is experienced. And while other phenomenologists have taken up this problem, non-phenomenological philosophers have actually criticized Husserl's account as being too detailed. Reichenbach, like Husserl, begins with an attempted experiential account of time, even discussing what he calls the emotive meaning of time, but he quickly pivots to physics because what he wants to do in the book is to give an account of the directionality of time on fundamental physical grounds, not on experiential grounds. We can understand Reichenbach's willingness to employ the inexact language of time as flowing as a concession to our intuitions about time, so that he can get past this informal account of time and get to the real meat of his theory, which is a physics-based causal account of time. We all share this dilemma, and the language we use in the attempt to formulate a theory of time is what Bergson called spatialized. Visualizing time as a river in which the same man cannot step twice because the second time it is not the same man and not the same river is a spatialization of time in which we attempt to get control of the flowing aspect of time by likening it to the length of a river which flows from its source to an ocean. In our conception of time, if our conception of time is based on our conception of space, even if only indirectly, this facilitates reductionist theories of time in which time is nothing but one dimension of a four-dimensional continuum in which our present experience is one slice through that continuum. And the listener will probably immediately recognize this as later theories of or interpretations of Einstein's relativity, which became quite common in the middle and the late 20th century. The problem of understanding time on its own terms is carried through to a philosophy of history in the problem of historical observation and evidence. The historian can never observe history, but only the traces that past actuality has left in the present, because past time has disappeared as soon as it has ceased to be the present. This is a problem that interests Reichenbach, and he gives a distinctive account of it that has few parallels in the philosophical literature. Reichenbach formulates his opening qualitative account of time in 5 statements. Statement 1, time goes from the past to the future. Statement 2, the present, which divides the past from the future, is now. Statement 3, the past never comes back. Statement 4, we cannot change the past, but we can change the future. The formulation of his fifth qualitative property of time is more guarded and is stated with some conditions. Reichenbach begins by saying, quote, "We might be tempted to formulate another difference by saying that the future is unknown, whereas the past is known," unquote. However, he says that this is obviously false because science does give us knowledge of some future events through prediction. Eventually, he converges on another formulation of essentially the same intuitive idea, which is this. Statement 5. We can have records of the past, but not of the future. And he concludes with statement 6. The past is determined, the future is undetermined. Reichenbach's hesitation over the formulation of his fifth qualitative property of time is relevant to the whole argument of the book, since he attempts to show how and why we have records of the past, but not of the future. The bulk of the book is about thermodynamics, which Reichenbach employs as an irreversible physical process from which the directionality of time can be derived. Reichenbach employs the intuitive example of footprints in sand as a way to illustrate his argument. Quote, "Suppose we find in the sand traces of footprints somewhat smoothed by the wind, but still recognizable as impressions of human feet. We conclude from this record that at some earlier time a man walked over the sand, thus causing the footprints. What is the logical schema of this inference?" Unquote. Now, just before this, he has said that the motion of the wind is always shuffling the surface of the sand and reducing it to a thermodynamic equilibrium so that the high points are taken down and the low points are filled up, and it reverts to a state of flatness after the footprint has been there and has eventually been worn away. He says also, quote, "We observe a state in which in the history of the isolated system is very improbable. How can we account for it? The answer is, as before, that we assume the observed state is to be a product of interaction, and we prefer an interpretation in which the system was not isolated in the past," unquote. And the book concludes a lot of distinctions between closed and open systems. He even says earlier in the book that thus we are allowed to regard the causal net of human history and perhaps of planetary history as open. Further along, he says, quote, "Explanation in terms of causes is required when we meet with an isolated system displaying a state of order, which is the history of the system, which in the history of the system is very improbable. We then assume that the system was not isolated at earlier times. Explanation presents order in the present as the consequence of interaction in the past. The otherwise improbable occurrence is thus presented as probable, either because the low one system probability is replaced by a high many system probability," unquote. And throughout the besides being concerned with thermodynamics throughout, it's also pervasively concerned the book with probability, and ultimately he describes historical explanation as a passage from improbability to probability, which sometimes requires that we supplement an apparently closed system that is approximating thermodynamic equilibrium, that it is impacted then by another system. So a human being walking over the sand and producing a footprint is another system that then intersects with this system of the flat sand in which a person leaves their footprint. And Reichenbach even constructs two theoretical languages, which he calls L1 and L2, one in which the time direction is forward and it's an explanation of causality, and one in which the time direction is backward, and it is what he calls, I think he calls it finality. So a couple more quotes from this section about historical records. Quote, the origin of the concept of cause is presumably to be sought in experiences in which man has been confronted by unexpected states of macro order, which have stimulated his imagination to assume past causes, unquote. And certainly when we do look at historical texts or ancient ruins, we infer from them these are states, unexpected states of macro order. And we assume past causes for this. And again, quote, records of this kind, which only the expert observer knows how to read, play an important part in geology and anthropology. We may mention fossils in the ground caused by living organisms being buried in the sand, stone tools cut by prehistoric men, granite rocks found arranged in relatively ordered lines deposited at the melting edges of glaciers in early geological periods, unquote. So there's an extensive discussion of what a historical record is and how that's a historical explanation, a scientific, and at the same time, a scientific explanation. And I find it interesting, fun in a way, that Reichenbach uses the example of footprints in sand. In 2022, the PBS series Nova, this is a popular science documentary series on American public television, aired an episode titled Ice Age Footprints, in which human footprints were discovered at White Sands, New Mexico. And they were shown to have been dated between 21,000 and 23,000 years before present, which is historically interesting because that puts back the origins of human beings in the New World several thousand years before what was commonly been assumed. Often the human habitation of the Americas was traced back to the Clovis culture, which has distinctive Clovis arrow points, which was about 15,000 years before present. So these footprints push back human habitation of the Americas maybe to as much as 23,000 years. And so we need to reformulate the history of the human presence in the Americas. The science demonstrated in this Nova episode is characteristic of the kind of scientific history that has significantly expanded our knowledge of human history since the second half of the 20th century. The inquiry implicitly anterior to the work described in this Nova episode is the kind of work that Reichenbach has done in his The Direction of Time. So Reichenbach gives us the deeper substructure of the scientific argument that is presumed by the people who are dating footprints at White Sands. Reichenbach's whole argument is based on a thoroughly scientific conception of records that can be applied more generally to any kind of history. The traditional historian confined his efforts to written documents and then later more forms of evidence like coins and inscriptions. And these are, of course, records of the past, no less than a footprint. And scientifically, they are essentially the same thing. That is to say, a scientific conception of records, as we find in Reichenbach, does not distinguish at the resolution of this argument between documents and footprints. So we can see from this the potential germ of a thoroughgoing scientific philosophy of history. Now, Reichenbach wrote, probably his most popular book was The Rise of Scientific Philosophy, and he did not include in here a section on the rise of a scientific philosophy of history, but we can certainly see that this could be the case based on Reichenbach's philosophy of time. So happy birthday, Hans Reichenbach, and thanks for listening.